and the Love Is podcast. I'm excited to welcome the host of the Love Is podcast, Kim Sorrelle. Kim, how are you? And I know you're excited about our guest.
I am doing great. Thank you, Neil. And yes, I am excited about our guest, Marc. Marc Smerling, you have done some things that have just been absolutely incredible. You've been nominated for Academy Awards and you've won Grammys and you've done or Emmys. I'm so impressed with your work. I love the Jinx. The Jinx did so well and it's so good and it's just done in sort of a different way than a lot of the things that you see. And now you've got this new podcast coming out, or it's come out, and it's so good. I just want to say thank you for coming and welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. Talk about Anthony Ramondi.
Yes.
Yeah, Anthony Ramondi. My word, what a story that man is. And for you to be a part of it, pretty exciting, I would think. But what is it like to work with Anthony Ramondi?
You know what? This is a interesting fact from a guy who works with a lot of mobsters and wise guys. I also make Crime Town and Crooked City, which are about organized crime figures in Youngstown and Providence, Rhode Island, and they're very charming. He's a very charming guy, Anthony, and he is. You feel real sympathy for him. He's been going through a lot of health issues. He wrote this book that he self-published on Amazon that became very popular and sort of ignited a conversation about the Mafia in Brooklyn, but mostly about the death of Pope John Paul I back in 1978, which has always been a conspiracy-laden death because John Paul was elected Pope and then died 33 days after. And he was elected during a time when the Vatican was under a lot of scrutiny for some financial misdealings of the Vatican Bank.
Wow. Oh my goodness. So that I wouldn't have thought that part. That's shocking. I mean, this could really have. This is not a conspiracy. Then it sounds like potentially.
Well, I mean, it's these things are hard to prove because the Vatican is a very closed system. I mean, it's not like I'm a big believer that conspiracies do not really exist in the real world because what we know is that conspiracies like the Sirhan being brainwashed to murder Robert Kennedy or the JFK assassination, they would take so many people to organize that and keep this secret for so long. Nobody keeps secret. It would come out. Something would come out, something extraordinary, especially with all the investigations. But the Vatican is unique because the Vatican is just its own little city in Rome. It's got full autonomy, and it's a very, very closed place. You can't really talk directly with anybody in the Vatican about these events.
It's so true. I always think the same thing, Marc, about conspiracies. How many people would have to stay secret? How many people would have to keep things secret? When they talk about Big Pharma or they talk about any other kind of conspiracies, something going on, that chances are really good it doesn't exist, but the Vatican is its own animal for sure. And I can't imagine Anthony coming out and saying these things just for the heck of saying them.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the big questions of the podcast is to look at this death, some 35 years, 40 years ago, and to try to figure out what happened from talking to people in Italy, talking to people who have written books about it, talking to people who were back then, and also, obviously, from telling Anthony's story, which is all sort of tied up. To be the guy that the Sicilian Mafia calls to help kill a pope, you have to have connections to the Sicilian Mafia here in the United States. And you have to be sort of a special case in a lot of ways. And Anthony, in his book, outlines his life, and his entire life is moving towards this one event.
Marc, what is Anthony thinking? Putting him, I know he's dying. What is he thinking doing this?
Yeah.
By putting all these secrets out? Is he hiding, or is he still in hiding, or he doesn't care if someone ends up taking him out now?
I think he doesn't really care. He's been so ill. I think that to a large extent, there's been a lot of controversy over his stories. Obviously, like all conspiracies, some people are going to believe it, some people aren't going to believe it. But I think really what he's thinking, and there's been a lot of talk about he just wants to cash in on a big story and make some money. And I don't think that's what's going on here. I really believe that Anthony has come to the end of his life, and he wants to sort of have some sort of, moment of recognition for who he is and what he accomplished. Even though what he accomplished is a very dark thing, he doesn't want to die without telling his story. And I run into this all the time. I mean, everybody's like, oh, the Mafia never speaks, omerta, blah, blah, blah. When certain mobsters get to a certain age, they start to talk about their lives because it's all they got. It's a story that they can tell, and it's one that they think, they want out there in the world. And Bob Durst was like that, too. I mean, Bob invited us out to California after we wrote this movie, All Good Things, with Ryan Gosling and Kirsten Dunst, and he suggested that we make a documentary about his life. Now, that seems kind of crazy, right? Because he knew he killed 3 people, for sure, Sorry, guys, I got a dog here.
That's
It's
cool. No, absolutely.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, I know. You would think that it's crazy that he would want to tell the story, but he did. But I think you're right. People get to a certain age, and listening to the introduction, even starting at the introduction, it just grabs you about Anthony's story. And one of the things that he talks about is that he wants to go to heaven. And he feels like he's got to confess his sins. Like, he sounds completely 100% sincere.
He is a brilliant guy at some level. He has a big brain. He remembers a lot of stuff. I mean, what's in that podcast is a small fraction of the stories he told. And his ear for detail is really incredible. So either he's the greatest mob historian in history, or he actually touched a lot of these events. And remember, these events, like some of the things he talks about, are well known in mob folklore. Like, one of the things he talks about is being related to Lucky Luciano, which gets him a lot of flack on the mob-related YouTube channels. It's a claim that sort of infuriates certain people. When we looked into it, we hired, somebody to look into his lineage. We found out that indeed his grandmother knew that his grandmother was in Sicily for when she got pregnant with his great grandmother was in Sicily when he got pregnant with his grandmother, and it very well could have been with Lucky Luciano, with Luciano, because she was living in a town right next to his town. So it's like, we can't prove it, but she was over there without her husband. The grandmother was the only person born in Sicily of all the kids she had. All the rest of them were born in Brooklyn. So it's possible.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that's the thing. All these things are possible. Now, hearing something like this, does this make people, I'm sure people are going to have conversations and say, could this happen to the president next, right? After we saw him on stage in the debate. I mean, could this happen to somebody else, especially when based on just saying, hey, it was a heart attack? How many times has this happened in life that the person really didn't have a heart attack and were murdered?
Well, who knows? I mean, that's a tough question to answer. Certainly, if you look back in the history of the Vatican, there have been several popes that died under questionable circumstances. And, historians believe that several of them were murdered. So it's not unheard of, for sure.
In any type of true crime situation. And that's where I think the excitement of this podcast comes, is the opportunity to really tell the story and how well true crime podcasts do, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating story. I don't know if you guys have seen The Godfather 3, the most ignoble of the Godfather series, but the reality is that thing is based, that that story was based on a book about the murder of John Paul I. So, you know, it's been out there in the world. It's a fascinating story. It has you know, money, it has greed, it has power, it's got everything. And you know, Anthony sort of brings it down to earth in a real way.
Oh, wow. Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, well, I find it absolutely fascinating. Everything you do, Mark, you do so well. And this is no exception. I love listening to this podcast. I know that it's going to do so great. People are going to want to hear it. And it is so true that the Vatican is its own animal out there and secrets can be kept. And I just find it absolutely fascinating that this man is at this stage of life and here he wants to come out and kind of tell all. How has there been any backlash because of it or anything happening around it?
Yeah, when the book came out, now the podcast has only been out a short time, and the podcast goes through all the iterations. We don't just talk to Anthony Ramondi and let him tell a story. We actually talk to other people who are part of this story. People from Italy, people from the United States who've looked into it, who've done a lot of work. So, but when his book came out, there was a tremendous amount of controversy. You know, there was a lot of backlash online, and there were a lot of people saying, "Oh, this could be true," and there are a lot of people saying it could. You know, it's all baloney. So it's a continuing controversial story.
Well, I'm going to have to listen to that for sure. Kim has a final question. It's a love question. It'll be interesting, Mark, but I think that anyone who does something as much that loves doing what they're doing, it's definitely going to be interesting. Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, so Mark, I took a year, I dedicated a year to figuring out the true meaning of love. And the things that I found out about love just blew my mind and rocked my world. So different than anything that I'd been taught about love. And which sounds so odd asking you this question when we're talking about Anthony and talking about your incredible work. But I am curious where love plays a role in it all. Like Anthony is a man, you know, he had family, he had friends, he had whatever. Like he's a man who definitely loved, but then was able to do all these things that were not so great. Where do you think love plays a part?
Yeah, I've always wanted to make a series about love, but with the eye of a true crime story, you know? I mean, there's a lot of, like, controversial and difficult love stories that could be told, you know? And it feels like, you know, that is one of the things in crime stories that create a connection between the criminal and the viewer, right? It's something that, you know, that we understand when we hear it, and we understand that emotion. We understand why people do things for love. And criminals sometimes do extreme things for love, you know? So ultimately, it's, you know, I'm always looking for the emotional underpinning of a story. And if you're listening to the Ramondi podcast, which you're obviously listening to, you get that he was someone who was part of a big family, and he was part of a family that loved him. And that's important, because then he's like a fully formed human being. He's just not some sort of cardboard cutout of a wise guy.
All right. Well, thanks again, Mark. Again, check out the podcast. It's available on all podcast networks. Appreciate it, Mark, and thanks for stopping by.
All right. Thank you for having me.
All right. That was a special simulcast of the Neil Haley Show and the Love Is podcast, guys. Take care.